Alrighty, we have the door. Yeah, it's a little bit of background noise, but I hope you can hear me. You can hear me well. And good morning, warm welcome to our session. Actually, very very warm welcome because I know this is not an easy one. I know for many privacy professionals, when they hear the word transfers, they're a little bit triggered. We know that. So first of all, thank you for being here with us today. Once again, I guess, trying to solve this puzzle, right? Which at this point feels a little bit like our very own privacy telenovela, like a long soap opera, right? Yes, we have these recurring characters, we have dramatic court rulings, we have political tension, and every time we think we might have solved it and reached the end, we have a whole new chapter ahead of us. It's our day-to-day, basically. So again, we appreciate you taking the time, your resilience, to be here with us today and continue this long path, which, it's a bit of a saga, right? It's a bit of a saga, and sometimes I think we lose a little bit of perspective, because at the end of the day, we are having this active discussion on transfers for 30 years, basically. So the foundation of what we know today in the GDPR was already there in the directive. And but yet, we did come a long way since GDPR. And I think that's probably something that we take it for granted. We take it for granted, and I think there are two achievements that we must really highlight. First of all, it's the fact that GDPR solidified this concept. It crystallized the concept of you can transfer data internationally, but the protection must travel with it. It sounds quite simple, but in practice, we all know how complex it can get, but we came a long way. And after 10 years of GDPR implementation, we managed to develop quite robust methodologies, governance structures, technical and organizational measures, and I guess significant know-how from an industry perspective, from an institutional perspective. And it's very nice to be sitting here today and gathering all of those views, which are crucial, and they were fundamental to get where we are today. Then a second point that we also take for granted, and is a very important achievement to reflect on now after 10 years of implementation, is the fact that GDPR became a blueprint globally. And it was very successful in pushing higher data protection standards across the globe. So those are two things that I think we need to always highlight. So if we think about, if we talk about transfers, mapping, SECs, VCRs, TIAs, you name it, all the acronyms that we love to hate, but that bring us together as a privacy community, those are no longer these abstract concepts, but rather they are an operational reality. And so those are the main points. And I think when you look at those, let's say, significant steps in terms of solidifying this concept, then we need to question, like, why did we reach a certain level of stability? I guess we feel like we reached a chapter of stability. We have our usual suspect, the US, the privacy framework is working for the moment, but by a show of hands, how many of you would bet your mortgage on this staying as it is? Nobody? A second house, maybe? Beach house mortgage? No? Yeah. There you go. So that's the contradiction, I guess, is the fact that it feels simultaneously more stable, but yet still very, very much uncertain. And it begs the question, why, right? Why so much uncertainty still? And I think there are two, let's say, overarching elements that we could look at, some key variables behind it. A is the fact that transfers are not an issue that is confined to our privacy bubble. As much as we would love to monopolize the topic, it is not. They are deeply linked to broader economic, political questions, and we need to factor this in to find pragmatic solutions. We need more people sitting on the table because it extrapolates our universe. And B is the fact that data is simply not an ordinary economic asset. It fundamentally reshapes how markets operate, their power structures, and many of the frameworks that we used to use to evaluate, to understand both macroeconomic and microeconomic tendencies, they're no longer suitable. They don't fit. And at some point, the issue is no longer whether the screw is tight enough, but rather it is whether we are using the right screwdriver. And I know this is not the most reassuring opening statement. I'm sorry for that. And you can tell me, Gabriela, thanks for nothing. But there is a silver lining. I think precisely because this topic is so complex, conversations like this are very, very important. We need a diverse set of experts in the same room trying to navigate this. Because let's be honest, AI will only make things more complicated. Cloud concentration makes things more challenging. The very nature of today's economy and the pace of technological development makes this more challenging. But at the same time, international transfers are not going anywhere. They are the core component of supply chains, and they are indispensable for businesses to operate, to grow, and to stay competitive. So the challenge ahead is not that simple dichotomy, which is often put out there as if we had to choose between protection and innovation. That's an oversimplification. The challenge is learning how to balance interests in a way that is sustainable, that is credible, that is pragmatic, and that is properly risk-based. So here goes our spoiler alert. The solution of many of our problems is already there, is embedded. This is the very core of GDPR. Now the question is, how do we operationalize it and how do we optimize our steps? And yeah, with that, I'm very, very happy to hand things over to my co-panelists, the people who will have to answer the hard questions. I'm here just raising them. So I'm very, very glad to welcome Tobias Juding, Head of International Department at the Norwegian Data Protection Authority, Kai Zenner, Head of Office and Digital Policy Advisor to MEP Axel Voss at the European Parliament, Anu Talus, Chair of the European Data Protection Board, and Lohelin Hood, Director of EU Government Affairs at Microsoft. So without further ado, I would like to start with you, Anu, and maybe with a reflection on this first 10 years of GDPR that flew by. How do you assess the overall impact of GDPR so far, and what do you consider to be the most significant achievements, and where do the biggest challenges still remain?
Thank you. Maybe this one. Can you hear me? No? Good. So even if we are focusing on data transfers today, I think that we need to take a little bit broader perspective when we are talking about what are the main achievements of the GDPR within the past 10 years. Well, it was a legislation which harmonized not only the regulation itself, the data protection regulation itself, but also the implementation of the data protection legislation in Europe. And I would say that one of the main achievements is the system how the data protection authorities cooperate today. So it did create a whole new system for the data protection authorities to cooperate between themselves when there is a topic which is relevant in several different member states. And if we look at this one-stop shop mechanism, well, of course, there is something where we could do even better. Of course, there is something where we could be even more efficient. We are now about to start implementing the procedural rules which were negotiated, which will then make the process more efficient. This will enter into force in April. Or it is already entered into force, but it becomes applicable April next year. But the system itself already functions, and it functions quite well, actually. We have delivered over 2,000 decisions in this mechanism. Out of these 2,000 decisions, only 11 have been also brought to EDBB for the dispute resolution mechanism. So I think that this is actually a quite good achievement with the GDPR. Then there are also other elements that we need to recognize. It creates the foundation for all the other digital legislation we have in Europe. So it creates the foundation for all the digital legislation. And of course, it has had also a significant impact beyond Europe. There are many third countries which have GDPR-like legislation, which have entered into force after the GDPR. If I recall the number correctly, I think that there was 137 countries now which have a GDPR-like legislation. Then when looking at the data transfers, because this is what we are discussing here today, it did introduce some new mechanisms for the data transfers as well. Of course, many of the tools did exist also within the previous framework, but it did introduce some new tools for data transfers as well. And when we are talking about the complexity of the data transfers, I must say that I don't actually see that it would come from the legal framework. And when the GDPR was negotiated, it took 4 years. Actually, the Chapter 5 was one of the fastest ones. So it's actually other elements which brings the complexity for the data transfer. So maybe this is briefly what I could say about the achievements of the GDPR and this legal framework.
Thank you very much, Anu. And you touched upon several crucial elements. I mean, just highlighting again that foundation. Indeed, it is the blueprint, and it created a very, very strong foundation. And yeah, reflecting a bit on your answer now, I would like to bring Kai in and ask a little bit the same, but from your perspective, the biggest challenges and overall impact so far.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for this question. And I will really need to fight against my need to hold now a small keynote on this topic, because I could really, describe a whole timeline, because I would say probably 10 years ago, my boss, even more, and I would have rejected many things you said and would have been extremely negative with regard to this question. But in our office, the two of us, and I guess also many people around us in our political group, do see nowadays a lot of positive aspects when it comes to the GDPR. And maybe I would start there. Indeed, as you just said, we also see it as a kind of centerpiece of this, what the Commission always calls the European way, third approach, especially compared to the US approach or Chinese approach. So a kind of value-based digital policy making, where there are certain core principles that have an actual meaning, that are connected to operational points, to concrete obligations for companies, and so on. And especially the GDPR, indeed, as you just heard, was also in our eyes really the starting point of this type of legislation that follows a bit more a North Star compared to previous times. Maybe when I start about the positive points, again, I would mention many things that you heard already, that indeed the GDPR brought a fundamental rights in the spotlight, that a lot of follow-up initiatives were happening based on the GDPR, that there's now finally a real accountability system, that there are structures, as we heard, that are now working better and better over time. With the GDPR enforcement regulation, we will see if it's helping. Hopefully, yes. But at least we can see it as an attempt to even improve what we had so far, and also learn a little bit more from mistakes in the past. And since we are here, I think it's an important point. And again, also there, especially Axel, my boss, changed a bit his opinion. I think it's a major improvement that we kind of have now this privacy community. So people like you here in the room outside that are so engaged in such a topic and are addressing certain issues that before were never really on the policy agenda, that before were never enforced, and so on and so on. I'm coming now to a few negative points, but also here I want to start with a positive, which is Axel and I were extremely disappointed when the second evaluation of the GDPR was being presented, because for us it was just like everything is great, and if there are some flaws, it's member states and companies that are not doing their job. This, in our eyes, has changed, and therefore, again, starting with the positive point, we feel it's very promising that now with the Digital Omnibus, with the GDPR enforcement regulation, but also with more broader discussions, we are really going into the details. If, for example, certain concepts are maybe outdated nowadays. Of course, in our political group, always data minimization is being mentioned, but also to our topic today, data transfers, certain approaches of the past. Are they really working still? Should we try out something completely new? I see this, let's say, openness, especially after the Draghi report, is definitely something positive that could lead to major improvements on all layers. Hopefully, one thing that is currently still not addressed at all, I would say, and I know that many NGOs are saying the same, Johnny Ryan, Max Schrems, and so on, the enforcement issue is unfortunately not on this agenda that I just mentioned. Also, when it comes to simplification and the omnibuses, we are there in a debate that could lead in the end to even the removal of those core principles that I also mentioned very positively at the beginning. But this big issue of enforcement or lack of enforcement, different enforcement activities, completely different interpretations, different capacity levels, and so on. This is not on the policy agenda. If you check what the Commission was proposing or planning, there is one study from DG GROW that was due in Q1 this year. No one heard from this study anymore. I questioned Renate Nicolai 2 times live on panels, but apparently there is nothing more coming in this direction, which I would say is a big shame. And again, despite all those positive steps, that we are still not able to address the core issues, I would say is a major downside after 10 years. And since I talked already about the Digital Omnibus, maybe to close with that, again, there are probably some good steps, but there are also huge risks because, and this I kind of mentioned already, I'm now in the parliament for 9 years, and as you all saw probably in your life in Brussels, we are often going from one extreme to the other extreme, especially in the parliament, also around. The GDPR was kind of untouchable in our eyes for many years, and any reforms were completely impossible. Nowadays, there is definitely much more willingness to make substantial changes that, however, as I said now several times, could also backfire a lot. And therefore, I really hope that politics this time find a good middle ground solution and is not going from one extreme to the other extreme, and again is finally focusing on those major issues that we have with the GDPR for over 10 years instead of making some, in my opinion, useless fights about certain comatas or certain smaller issues that are for companies not that harmful in terms of compliance costs, for citizens not that harmful when it comes to fundamental rights protection. This maybe as a final wish for the next months of negotiations.
All right, a wish list. That's I think it's safe to say that again there is a good foundation there, and what we observe is not something that is particular or that it only happens with the GDPR itself. I think the foundation, a principles-oriented regulation, risk-based, is quite suitable looking at the environment that it needs to regulate. And I think it's about exactly the complexity of the object of the regulations. And again, it's not only GDPR. I think any regulation in the, let's say, data economy is facing quite similar issues. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned and ways to optimize it indeed, but also looking at our existing toolbox, which already put forward a lot of substantial structures to regulate the digital economy and see if we've properly leveraged what is there. Are we implementing? I think very often it is a matter of implementation, right? A lot of hiccups and issues too, also across member states, within and across different sectors. So there are many layers to that. And talking about those layers, I would like to hear a bit from Tobias, from a perspective of a data protection authority and looking more specific at international data transfers. It's really interesting to hear that drafting those provisions was actually quite easy, and that the implementation can get a bit more complex. Tobias, can you give us some insights on what it looks like in the day-to-day, and maybe walk us through some enforcement challenges in the field?
Well, I can certainly try. So I like to say that I only started working on international transfers for real on the 16th of July 2020. So many of you will remember that date. That is the date that the Schrems II ruling was handed down, and things changed quite a bit, I would say. So up until that point, a lot of controllers, at least in Norway, have been thinking that, as long as we have SCCs in place, it's all good. And then the court said something that was really profound and really important. In essence, it said the GDPR is not about formalism, it's about real protection. And if, the protection set out in SCCs are not really effective in practice, then you need to actually ensure that they are effective somehow. You need to apply supplementary measures. And I think that makes sense, because we don't want the GDPR just to be protection on paper. The GDPR was always about substantive protections. But what does that actually entail for companies? And many of you will probably know this. First, you need to find a transfer tool. That's fine. And then you need to map what kind of third country legislation and practices apply. Right? So if you have a subcontractor in Paraguay, you need to look into Paraguay law. I mean, where do you start? If you're an SME, that's quite difficult. And then you need to assess, furthermore, how that law applies to your transfer. And when we're speaking about governmental access, it's often about covert operations. You don't necessarily know what's going on, but you still need to assess how does this apply to my transfer? How do you do that? And once you've done that, then you need to assess whether that governmental access that you're facing in Paraguay or some other country, whether that is necessary and proportionate in democratic society, and whether the level of protection is essentially equivalent. If you're an SME, you don't have a compliance department, how do you actually do that? That's quite difficult. So then they come running to us and they ask us, excuse me, is Paraguay legislation proportionate? And I don't know how to respond to that, you know? And of course, as regulators, we will always say, well, accountability, you need to carry out your own assessments. But in this case, I think we also need to be honest that these assessments can very quickly get quite complicated, right? Which is why we're kind of faced with a dilemma. I think we need to really look into these issues and actually make those assessments, because the risks to data protection flow from the personal nature of personal data, not the size of your company, not the size of your compliance department, not the size of your paperwork stack, right? So we really need to carry out these assessments. But then what do we see on the ground? Does this actually yield a high level of protection in practice when people don't necessarily know where to start? And then, you know, as enforcers, I think our priority in Norway, at least up until quite recently, has been to focus more on providing guidance on how companies can carry out these assessments rather than to, you know, just immediately issue fines. That would not be very constructive. And then we're faced with a lot of statements such as, we don't know how to do this, we can't do this, we can't change our system, it's not possible in the short term, it's not possible in the long term. Quite a few controllers have actually said to us, when we kind of explain the requirements, they have said, well, do you want us to just shut down Norway today? Because in their view, that will be the result. And honestly, I don't necessarily agree that we need to shut down Norway or any other European country for that matter. I think there is a way forward. And I think that the answer is contained in the GDPR itself as it stands, because there are also transfer tools that can actually centralize these assessments. So rather than every individual company carrying out their own assessments, you know, SCCs, and then applying supplementary measures, also trying to figure out what is, you know, good enough in terms of encryption, pseudonymization. That's also very difficult, right? So this is where I would kind of like to see the conversation going as we move forward, to kind of look more at those more centralized tools. Of course, we have adequacy decisions. As the Norwegian DPA, we want adequacy decisions. There are certain instances where, you know, issues may arise, where people say, oh, there is an issue with this adequacy decision. Our position will always be, okay, well, let's see how we can improve things rather than to just remove adequacy, because it actually means a lot for very many companies. But there are actually also some other tools that can centralize this. And I'm not sure if maybe we'll just leave that as a cliffhanger for now.
Fair enough. And I have to say, it's the first time I hear that your first day at work was the day of the shrimps decision. I mean, a bit of a Trojan horse of eventful. Yeah, thank you, Tobias. And again, I think you mentioned some key aspects. One of them I'm thinking Lohelin will very much welcome, which is the approach of providing more guidance. We need it. We also need harmonized guidance. So really having all those authorities getting together within the DPB and providing that to mitigate, the biggest, let's say, the elephant in the room, which is fragmentation. That's at the end of the day. So from your perspective, Lohelin, can you tell us a little bit about the operational challenges as a cloud service provider?
Sure. You hear me? Yeah. Thanks for that. And first of all, I would like to, before trying to answer the question, I think you asked from your perspective, but I would like to double down on what Tobias said. I mean, it's not because we are a big global tech provider that we are confronted with these questions. Many companies are. You can be small, you don't have to be in tech. You can be at first sight quite local, but still export data. So there's a lot of entities who are confronted with that. So we are not at all unique in that sense. I wanted to, and if I can continue a little bit on that parenthesis, there is also a lot of, like, it's important to acknowledge also the enormous value that there is in data transfers. And right now with geopolitical tensions and digital sovereignty, there is like sometimes this sympathy for, hey, what if we just try to keep it local again, and we transfer maybe less data, and we go back to our old borders. There is a little bit of sympathy for that, but I would like to highlight that in 2025, OECD has done a study on the economic impact of they call it data regulation, but it really focuses on data transfers. And the conclusion they come to is that if all countries were to have restrictions on data transfers and data localization requirements, but only for a limited number of sectors, ICT, telco, finance, if that were to be the case, all countries would do that. It would lead to close to 1% of GDP loss worldwide. Then, of course, if you go to full autarky, it's even more and so forth. But interestingly, what they also say is that if you do away with regulation, you also increase cost, because we need data transfer regulation in order to enhance the trust. And that's normal because you're across border and systems and traditions are not the same. So, voilà, I wanted to make that parenthesis. Then we go to regulation, and Tobias has already highlighted, so you have right now, most uses either adequacy decisions, but the Commission cannot do more than what they already do, so we need to be realistic about what we can expect beyond the 15 jurisdictions that are approved now. And then the next go-to mechanism is usually SCCs. I don't know if you know, but in 2020, Digital Europe did a sample among quite a lot of companies, and they 85 of the respondents said that they were using SCCs, 70% in SME. So, but still very high. So then, of course, we come to the complexity of SEC, and I tend to agree with Anu that the GDPR was more simple than what the Court of Justice made of it. Tobias, you have very well described that indeed there is more. It's not sufficient. It's okay to use SECs, but it's not sufficient. You also need to look at what is basically the legal framework in the countries you're exporting to, and whether those generally, I mean, of course, I'm saying it more rough than what it is, but whether those countries meet the minimum bar of the GDPR. And I think, as you have already said, Tobias, that is a hard. It's a hard assessment. It's a hard assessment for you. It's a hard assessment for us. It's an even harder assessment for smaller companies. And I think like two things make that especially hard, and I would also say inefficient. That is, first of all, even in EU law, there is no clear standard, because the area of law, it's also, the questions also concentrate about, you know, when is government access jeopardizing the protection of data subject, right? When is government, that is like often the core of the questions you're looking at. But even in EU law, there is no common standard for that question. And you see that the protection in among member states of what protection data subject should get against government access, it varies from country to country. So it's a very, very hard question if you have to assess that as a company. And then in addition to that, the point that you have mentioned, Tobias, is the fact that it's super inefficient, because all companies have to do that right now. And I think the Court of Justice has been criticized, and I do think rightly so, because they sort of have pushed the geopolitical questions onto the level of the individual companies and the regulators, and it's sort of multiplying the inefficiencies rather than trying to centralize it. No, I'm not saying voila. The last thing I would maybe like to add is that it's a little bit theoretical, but there has been in scholars and regulations, sometimes there is this debate about should Chapter 5 be governed or interpreted with a risk-based approach, as many other provisions of the GDPR, or should it be looked at under a more absolutist approach? I think I will not make this very long, but I think it's also relevant to mention that because it adds to the complexity. And I do think, personally, I think that the Court of Justice, by its own decision, has already somehow opened the door for a risk-based approach, because I mean, it adds that you have to look at what is the risk actually in the countries. But for those who are not convinced, I can warmly recommend a very well-written article by Professor Boris Paul from 2025, which pleads, he pleads very clearly for a risk-based approach also under Article 46.
All right. Thank you so much. And out of curiosity, because it's almost lunchtime, to make sure you guys are here with us, by show of hands, how many of you are somehow managing transfers on your day-to-day work or here and then? Yeah. Just out of curiosity, No, so I guess you mentioned Article 46 and looking again at the toolkit. What do we have at our disposal, and understanding the different layers, the complexity. And I think the bottom line is some level of redundancy is needed to create that legal certainty and yeah, enable trust. That's what we are at the end of the day all looking for. And Tobias already almost gave a bit of a spoiler of the next block of the discussion. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more and reflect on what we have, and maybe also on the underutilized tools that are at our disposal?
Thank you, and yes, I would. But first, I just want to come back to something Laureline was saying, also to make it a bit more, dynamic. I love the fact that you kind of raise this issue of risk-based versus absolutist approach, because I find it very, very difficult to navigate. And when we speak about risk, we also need to be mindful, the risk of what? There are certain elements to the assessments that you need to carry out that it's very difficult because you're dealing with uncertainty. You don't really know what the practices in a third country is. You don't know necessarily how the secret agencies of a certain country will operate. So risk is often a tool to kind of deal with uncertainty, and the same goes for encryption. Nothing is 100% certain. So there is I see risk as a tool to kind of deal with those questions. At the same time, just an anecdote from Norway. After the Schrems II ruling, we kind of provided some advice, and then a lot of companies said, well, this is not what we wanted to hear. And so there was actually another public authority or entity in Norway that issued alternative guidance. And they kind of said, okay, we're not the data protection authority, but this is also one way to address it. And it was very much risk-based. And risk-based in the sense that what is the risk of government access in a third country that is not proportionate nor necessary? So essentially, what is the risk that you will have unlawful processing of personal data? What is the likelihood of that happening, and what is the consequence? Also saying that, okay, so maybe we should accept that, some individuals will be subject to unlawful processing of the personal data in a third country, but we think that the consequence is not so big, so, it's fine. And for us as an authority, that was kind of difficult to swallow because, we do work to kind of ensure that no one is subject to unlawful processing of personal data. So it just kind of shows the complexity of this. But like I said, I think it is very, very difficult to handle. And also, we're also quite concerned that if you say that, if we introduce risk assessments where risk assessments were not included from the side of the co-legislators, Will this have a spillover effect? We will then see, you know, when we're enforcing consent requirements, that companies will say, well, in this case, the personal data, you know, they're not very intrusive, you know, they're not very interesting, so maybe it's okay to have, you know, deceptive design in our cookie banner. You know, that's why we're worried about risk. But sorry, that was a long anecdote. Apologies. The thing about the GDPR, though, is, you know, whether we call it risk or not, it was always based on the principle, the meta principle of proportionality. You know, for us as the Norwegian authority, when we enforce the GDPR, we have a risk-based approach to enforcement. And compliance in itself is also methodology that is in its very nature risk-based. So what we always say is, like, don't start with the small fires, start with the bigger fires. Focus on what will yield the best outcomes in practice. So that will always be a guiding tool when we enforce the law. So that's also a way that risk actually comes in here in this landscape. But yeah, you know, what are the tools that we have? I think at this point, you know, speaking about how we can kind of centralize assessments, centralize them, and avoid duplicating effort, as was mentioned here, quite rightfully so. It might not be a surprise considering who is organizing this panel, but I think that we need to look more into codes of conduct and certification. I mean, the reason why I said that is because under these tools, I mean, if you're looking to get certified under a certification scheme that has been approved as a transfer tool, then you will be a data importer in a third country, not subject to the GDPR, and then actually you need to carry out an assessment. Will my third country's legislation apply to me and the transfer, the data I receive, and will it somehow undermine my obligations pursuant to the certification? So there's still a level of an individual assessment, but it's on the level of the importer. So let's say that you have 20 data importers in third countries that get certified or that choose to adhere to a code of conduct. That also means that, you know, let's say you have 1,000 European companies transferring data to each of those 20 importers. Those 1,000 exporters can then trust the scheme because they know that their importer is certified, their importer is adhering to a code of conduct, and they have made that assessment. So you don't need to duplicate that 1,000 times 20 importers. So that's where I see that there is actually a way forward that we probably haven't explored so much now. I don't know, maybe Arne would like to touch on this later, but the EDPB recently approved a certification scheme as a transfer tool. So now we're kind of seeing this actually come to light. And I think that this is really exciting. I'm quite excited to see how this will kind of work out. And I do think that this is a way that could potentially simplify a lot, especially for SMEs, but not only for SMEs, obviously.
Thank you, Tobias. And I think that's the thing, GDPR, bringing back something that I think all of you mentioned at some point. A lot of the answers are already there. And when it comes to the difficulty to implement across different environments, different industries, and so forth, the answer was there. I mean, you have codes of conduct and certifications that basically are there to specify the implementation of GDPR within a specific sector or within a specific processing context. So the idea from the beginning was exactly like, okay, this is a general regulation for everyone, but we do need specific technical and organizational measures that materialize the risk-based approach and that can create guidance within a certain environment. And if we look, especially as we at the technology, like at more complex technologies, they are basically, it's a bit of a black box for most of controllers that need to assess whether or not a cloud provider or are compliant. So having a code of conduct or a certification that is specifying the rules, that is basically translating those vague provisions into specific technical and organizational measures, can create a lot of clarity and tackle a lot of the challenges that we've mentioned. So I would like to hear from Anu. I know that the EDPB mentions in its current strategy, I think 2024 to 2027, the importance of such tools to support proper implementation of GDPR. They're of course not a silver bullet, but it's about helping, right? So can you give us a little bit of the EDPB's view on that?
Yeah, sure. These are tools which could be used a bit more widely, and here too, I think that what we could address here or focus here is how to provide simplicity or how to simplify the process of using these tools. And what we are doing, for example, at the moment, we are working on some tools to give a help with practical implementation. And an example of this is the TIA Transfer Impact Assessment template. So this is something what we are working on at the moment. So I think that here it's also perhaps the same underlying theme which we have had here a lot at the table. So providing the simplicity, the simplification to use these tools, which do exist already in the GDPR. And like you said, for example, when it comes to certifications and codes of conduct, they provide the possibility to have a bit more tailor-made approach on certain sector, on certain specific sectors. So they are, of course, a type of tools which can bring added value when it comes to data transfers. Yes, maybe that's enough.
Oops, thank you. And yeah, I would turn to Lohelin, that has been involved in the development actually of the Cloud Code of Conduct that was the first operational transnational code of conduct under Article 40. It was approved actually 5 years ago. Today, it's our anniversary, by the Belgium Data Protection Authority. That was the lead authority after receiving the green light of the EDPB. So you were looking at a very robust process that it's embedded in the GDPR. So, and besides the approval itself, you also have an accredited monitoring body that needs to go through an accreditation process with the lead authority as well. So again, a quite robust process. So the GDPR puts forward. Lohelin has been involved in the main code, which was again approved 5 years ago, and the General Assembly of the code is currently working actually on an on-top module to the code to address international data transfers, and we have been working on it since Shrimps 2. Basically trying to find more solutions to prevent operational hiccups and create a redundancy where needed, and the specific guidance for cloud. So could you share a little bit about your experience there?
Absolutely. And so maybe to your introduction, maybe I would like to add that the EU Cloud Code of Conduct General Assembly, what a name, for which scope Europe is doing the secretariat. So who is behind that? Maybe just say that it's first of all, it's an open group. So if you are interested after this presentation, certainly go and speak with Gabriella. But we are mainly cloud providers with a focus on B2B. So we act as processor in that group. And so we have, for example, Cisco, SAP, Google, Microsoft, but also smaller like Fabasoft and so forth. But it's open. And so indeed, after the general Cloud Code of Conduct, which is very much focused on Article 28, we now are thinking of, can we not extend this with an additional module for data transfers, which can be used either as according to the choice, either as an additional legal basis or as, for some maybe if there is no adequacy, it could also be used as a standalone legal basis. But of course, that requires that then it follows the procedure of Article 40, has to be approved, and so forth. So basically, I think the advantages of such a possible code of conduct is, of course, that you try to develop something that is closer to the sector, closer to the technicities, also based in real life examples, and that by doing that you keep it hopefully more flexible. And a bit, also pragmatic, especially then for smaller providers who would like to potentially join. So, of course, it should incorporate the guidance from the EDPB, the case law, the GDPR itself, of course. The idea is, the goal of it is to come up with sort of, you could say, semi-standardized recommendations that give guarantees both to data subject and that also give useful tools to companies. Examples of that are, how do you communicate, how do you inform, what kind of supplementary measures are appropriate in which case, and so forth. And the idea is to make it scalable, meaning that you can apply it to more than one jurisdiction, right? Two more elements is, you can say, but the industry is discussing that, and what are they discussing? Well, we also have, of course, through the presence of Scope Europe, we have some independent experts, and of course, this needs to be endorsed by first a local DPA and then the EDPB in the end, which was also done like with the former code of conduct. So I think there is some, and then importantly also, once it's live, there needs to be an important monitoring of the code by an independent body. So that is also an important guarantee to make this not like an industry club thing, so to say. So is this the way forward? We hope, but I must be honest, it's also difficult. It's a bit the chicken and the egg story. It's like with the uptake of pets, privacy enhancing technologies. So when companies don't see an immediate way forward, it's also harder to get traction for those things internally. So yes, we work on it, but it is also hard. We have to admit that, right?
Absolutely, and I think you've mentioned several important aspects on how challenging this process of what we call co-regulation. So this is not pure self-regulation. It's not the Wild West. Let the industry say what they want to do. Quite the contrary, GDPR, again, quite robust framework. So the approval process of a code of conduct, especially for European-wide codes of conduct, is quite strict, and we need basically every single authority to greenlight it at the EDPB, and we know very well how difficult it is for all member states to agree on something. So when you do reach that finish line of having a code of conduct approved, that creates that legal certainty, and it's a very important step when we look at international transfers, exactly to solidify what kind of supplementary measures, how do we implement this in the specific context. So it's indeed is a quite complex process. We said complexity so many times, I'm very sorry for that, but there's no way around it. But I would like to look at Kai now and get his perspective on the potential role of industry-driven standards, and especially those that have an active participation of the authorities. In the case of international transfers, you even need the Commission to give general validity, so another stamp there in the process. So how do you see their role?
Yeah, so I will do three things. First of all, I will say why I like it and why I think it's an extremely good addition to our policy. toolbox. Then I will use the AI example to showcase why it's not working at all, and then make some proposals what we could do, because again, I do believe in it to improve the situation in the future. So let me start. And again, a lot of references now to the AI Act, because this was what I was working strongly on for now many years. Let me start there. My personal ideology, or I'm in the camp that really thinks for the digital field, laws should be extremely simple, principle-based. For me, the Product Liability Directive from 1985, I think 14 articles, is kind of the law I would love to see in most of the digital areas, because again, back then, lawmakers agreed on fundamental principles, on fundamental mechanism, but then in particular, it was back to the courts to decide on a specific case and so on. On the AI Act, based on what I was just saying, I really liked it in the European Parliament that despite some reluctance in principle from Social Democrats and Greens when it comes to industry-driven standards, or an industry club, like you said, they had those perceptions, but they were saying from the beginning, no, we agree with Renew, we agree with EPP. AI is such a fast developing space. We cannot put everything super descriptive in the AI Act. We need some complementary tools, secondary legislation, but also codes of conduct, code of practice, standardization, and so on. And again, I'm still very happy that there is, until today, this kind of common understanding among, I would say, almost all political groups. And despite the problems that I'm now mentioning, I do believe that there is no other way. So again, especially if you have a horizontal AI Act that is covering so many different sectors and use cases and scenarios, think about the easiest and most best known example, human oversight. Article 14 makes a lot of sense in certain use cases. In other use cases, the famous Philips eye surgery robot, it doesn't help. It's actually increasing the risk enormously, and so on and so on. And all of that you can, of course, address if you have a more granular, more specific way of building use cases, describing certain situations, and so on. Why it's not working right now when it comes to AI Act is, first of all, and I said already a bit about it, and I see it really as a huge problem. As you see, policymakers in the last years have so many problems among themselves. There are so many highly debated topics that standards, but also, let's say, implementing acts and so on, are always a super easy move if you cannot agree on something. And this, again, I find unacceptable in democratic terms. Certain things they are forced to decide, and they are not. And then they are telling companies, okay, now, I don't know, decide how to do a fundamental rights impact assessment, or how to understand what fair is, because they could not agree among themselves how to define fair. And this is, again, for me, the first problem, and we see it in JTC 21, in the AI standardization group, non-stop, that those people that are brilliant, that are investing a lot of time, often a lot of their personal time, in order to make it work, are very often confronted with questions they are just not able to answer. So if you are going this way, the first point, again, going back to 1985 PLD, you need to, as policy makers, you need to create a law that is extremely clear, where all important political decisions have been taken, and then it's feasible on a technical level to make all the follow-up decisions, let's say. Then, of course, you all know, it's public knowledge. We have, of course, with those standardization, but also in codes of conduct and codes of practice. Again and again, this issue that, yes, there are large companies. I don't see it as something bad. But of course, they have more capacities than the small SME from Bavaria. If you are going on the international level, think about ISO standardization meetings. One in Jakarta, the next in Johannesburg, the next in Los Angeles. How should a smaller player pay that? It's impossible. So in the end, even with the layoffs, I guess even for bigger companies nowadays in the tech sector, it's becoming quite impossible to do that. And yeah, this issue is not really addressed and leads again and again to a situation where certain sectors do not really have a voice, where certain perspectives are not being included. And of course, this is extremely problematic in terms of the outcome. And of course, the pacing problem, standardization takes time, which again, you saw now in the AI Act, the infamous stop the clock, why we did the AI Omnibus, because we realized, we said it from the beginning, by the way, standardization takes time and we need more time, and especially JTC 21 needs more time. And this time pressure that especially the Commission put on them is really not helpful in terms of quality. So those are the bigger issues that I saw. And since I'm talking already quite long, but yeah, shortly on let's say possibilities to make it work, because again, I do believe it's for tech policy the only way out. It's, in my opinion, again, you cannot put everything in a legal text. So how can we improve it? First of all, you all know the standardization regulation will be updated end of the year. I really hope that we have a Draghi mindset there and are trying out completely new things. My favorite point would be, for example, tax exemptions for every company that is sending standardization people and so on. But you need really to think out of the box, bring completely new ideas. And again, also, Breton tried it before, but you need to touch up the governance issues in code of practices, in standardization groups, and so on. You need also to think which role a politicized commission nowadays should play. In my opinion, it should be minimal. This HAC consultant, I think is the name, that is in the end, after companies and NGOs spend so much time in finding a good way, this consultant is coming in, is making changes, no one knows what is happening there. Those things cannot happen more in your area with code of practices, code of conducts, where the commission is involved, how they are organizing the meetings, especially on the code of practice. GPI, scripted presentation, 2 minutes from each company. Yeah, this doesn't bring anything. So also here, again, in order to make it work, we need to really revolutionize the whole way how we do it. We need to be much more dynamic. Again, now on AI, there's a group of MEPs that are still in the parliament. They would be super willing to attend meetings. Why were they never invited? There is someone from the commission explaining a little bit what the co-legislators wanted to do, but the commission, again, is not in the place to do it. It would be either attachés or parliamentarians who could say, okay, here we made this wording inclusion and so on and so on. Maybe if standardization bodies or code of practices, code of conducts are identifying certain issues, have questions, why you are not organizing bigger joint meetings to clarify it. But this goes back and back and back again to my point. The way how we do it, again, it's the right tool, but the way how we do it, I think, especially in my AI example, is really not working. And what I don't want to see is that this right tool is in the end being rejected because of bad outcomes that could be easily fixed.
Thank you, Kai. And I guess that's the point. I think AI actually can learn a lot with the GDPR, and to have some like closing statements. We won't hold you through lunch. Don't worry, because we could stay here for long. But I will ask everyone just for a short closing statement, maybe a reflection on what we discussed. What are the main takeaways, basically, and looking at the way forward also in the context of course, the omnibus and what we are going through at the moment. Some final thoughts. Anu.
Thank you. Well, when looking at when talking about the future, we of course need to also take the omnibus into account, and what we have discussed here about the simplification, cutting the red tape. Here I actually also want to underline that we, the data protection authorities, we gathered together last year in Helsinki, and we made a commitment ourselves to enhance the stakeholder cooperation, for example, to work on more, strengthen the harmonized approach among ourselves, and also to make, the title GDPR made easy. So to provide the tools that provide the tools which would make it more easy to be compliant. And when we are putting the data transfers in this context, we can see that the Digital Omnibus, at least by so far, doesn't have anything about the data transfers or the personal data transfers. So unless there is something coming up when thinking about the future, it is the current framework that we have, and the current framework that we can use to make the data transfers more efficient, for example. Here, I think that the new tools which we have discussed here are something that we should take an advantage of, and also because they provide a way for those, I don't know if I can say outsiders, but for those who are not really involved within the process, to easily recognize the cases where it should be safe to trust that the data transfers are safe. So I think that we have a lot of good tools we can use for that, and we need to keep in mind that it's important to try to find also the ways to simplify the overall framework.
So yes, very much aligned with Anu. I think we have discussed in length that the data transfer framework is complex. The upside of that complexity is that there is a huge potential for simplification. And as you said, strangely enough, we have not seen anything in that regard, nor in the data union strategy, nor in the digital omnibus. So how do we go from here? I think we have to work on all fronts. I think Anna was really happy to hear that you're working on like templates TIAS. I think that is one way to do it. Maybe bringing together knowledge about legal systems of different countries would also be a way. Additional guidance on when and how supplementary measures can be taken, but industry also needs to do its job, as I try to tell. And then I think the last point I would maybe like to add is that we are sometimes in a difficult geopolitical situation, and it's harder than before to discuss with other stakeholders, but we need to continue doing that. And this is a call upon the policymakers around the table. We have those forums like the OECD data with trust, free flow of data with trust, like the global, I always have the acronym wrong, the Global Privacy Rules Cooperation Forum, CBPR. And all of these instruments, we need to continue working on those and discussing there. It's not because sometimes politics don't find the answers that at other levels we cannot continue working on the answers.
So I must say that I remain a believer in the GDPR. No surprise there. But I feel like there's more to do and more to learn. And I think one of the things that we touched upon during this discussion is that there are additional tools that maybe are underutilized. I think there's much more to learn in terms of how the GDPR can be applied to new technologies, but also what I sense is a shift in the mindset generally, that we are more focusing on how to operationalize it. And here, I think what Anna mentioned with a focus on the EDPB on tools to make it easier. I mean, the GDPR sets some boundaries, but there's still lots we can do in terms of how we actually implement it in practice. So we do have a lot of room to navigate. And I would just like to shortly add a reflection that no one asked for, but considering the world that we currently live in, where we see democratic processes being undermined, power balances being shifted, fundamental rights being scoped down, hybrid attacks is just a new normal, and those attacks also target our data. I think now is the time more than ever that we do actually need the GDPR. Thanks.
Yes, so I will basically just complement what has been said, because I agree with all three co-panelists. I think it's completely wrong if we are now kind of trying to get rid of certain principles or achievements that we made over the last 10 years. So indeed, also the GDPR. It's good, as I said at the beginning, that there is now more willingness to look into concrete issues that are there, that are being unsolved, like international data transfers, but also many others. I hope it's even done more. I agree with the two of you that especially new AI tools, when it comes to policy making, when it comes to implementation, also enforcement, could help a lot. Again, what we discussed in the previous question, also other, let's call it, policy making tools like code of practice, binding corporate rules, and so on and so on. All of those tools, or the famous Article 25 privacy by design that so many people had high hopes in, also here is a lot of potential. So hopefully we come up with new ideas when it comes to making use of the framework instead of kicking the framework away. And again, maybe the one point that was touched up on, that of course is one of my lines that I'm always making when it comes to policy silos, the whole digital omnibus approach now, and there, if I understood you right, I would agree very much with Anu. We could do much better. We could really check and review our overall legal system for the digital field. I know the EDPS is a big fan of the UK Digital Regulation Coordination Forum, Axel and I also. And this, for example, would probably help us a lot, because there are so many horizontal topics like anonymization for AI models, like certain security issues and so on, where it would just help if all the different EU bodies or parts of the Commission would just be forced to sit at the table to work on it. And it's not only the UK that is using it by now. You find it in the Netherlands, in France, it's more and more in development. In Germany, we have at least something informal. In Ireland, there is something very close to the UK model. And this is just another example of adding additional elements to solve long-standing problems without getting rid of the whole thing that made a good international name and is not so bad as it's often being framed.
Thank you so much, Kai, and thank you to this outstanding group of panelists. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you guys for sticking around, and look forward to seeing you soon.